I am reading now from Censored number 108, The Blame Game by William J. Eisenman, PhD. Quote, "The first casualty when war comes is the truth," said Senator Hiram Johnson. We witnessed very little truth during the 8 years of the George W. Bush Cheney regime. And now, what we are witnessing regarding the financial meltdown and who is to blame is childish and ridiculous. The Republicans are blaming the Democrats. Republicans and other liars would have you believe that the Democrats in power for less than 2 years caused it all. This country's financial meltdown was nearly 30 years in the making, and 8 years of Bush Cheney put the last nails, in America's coffin. Total deregulation unleashed the devil's greed throughout our economy. American national interests have been sacrificed to the global economy, and 1 in 6 manufacturing jobs have gone bye bye since Bush Cheney took office. Patrick Buchanan said the Republican Party has signed off on economic treason. The only thing that matters to Republicans today is power. Our nation's economy was meant to form us into a people dependent on each other and not to rely on foreign trade. Today, America imports 30% of China's exports, and we are responsible for 100% of China's growth. According to Pat Buchanan, during America's protectionist high tariff years from 1869 to 1900, real wages were up 53%. Commodity prices were down 58%. The GNP quadrupled. The national debt fell by two-thirds, and custom duties provided 58% of all federal revenues. From 1870 to 1913, the United States economy grew more than 4% a year, while industrial production grew by 5%. The protectionist era was among the most productive in this nation's history. Adam Smith's invisible hand was supposed to keep greedy merchants and manufacturers from making excessive profits gained from their evil activities. The invisible hand is competition. Greed is inherent in capitalism, and greed must be tamed and made to serve the public interest, or else capitalism will devour all before it. This country's financial meltdown is a glaring example of unleashed capitalism serving only private interests. What happened was that what moral standards there were simply adapted themselves to all opportunities presented. Once upon a time, all property belonged to the king. The king's subjects had to fend for themselves. They were on their own. At this time, strictly speaking, there was no middle class, and poverty was rampant. Most people worked in agriculture, and some honorable ways of making a living were land holding, booty from soldiering, usury, a big one today among credit card companies, and bribery. In America, the government owns all the land, even your house. Through eminent domain, the government can confiscate any real estate. Today, business rails against the government until they need a bailout. Yet the idea of minimal government is anachronistic. Sustainable economic development needs an effective modern state. The World Bank reports that a government must provide security from civil disorder, and criminal violence, security from destitution and unemployment and exclusion. None of this is possible unless markets serve us. And if we are the government, why this fear of government? What caused this alienation? Most times when people hear talk about the economy, their eyes glaze over and they snore. But this financial meltdown was avoidable, and it is serious. In fact, your life may be at stake because of it. Things have changed. The first of G.W. Bush's recessions was a jobless recovery, and this has been happening for nearly 30 years. The Bush administration did not produce one net job. At this moment, the official unemployment figure stands at 9.5%. However, in reality, the figure is more like 15 to 20%. The real unemployment and cost of living figures have been fudged for decades. The truth is, economic growth is no longer making most people wealthier. It's causing inequality and insecurity. Economic growth has failed miserably to give us a better world. 4 companies slaughter 81% of American beef. Cargill Incorporated controls 45% of the global grain trade. 4 multinationals control over 70% of fluid milk sales in the United States. 4 companies control 85% of global coffee roasting, and 5 companies control 75% of the global vegetable seed market. A farmer's profit in 1950 was 35%. Today, it's only 9%. The farmer gets 10% of the food dollar. 100 years ago, 60% of Americans were farmers. But today, farmers make up 1% of the population. 1/3 of all farm subsidies go to the largest 2% of farms that are in the top 10% in size. Sometime in the late 1970s and early 1980s, our economy began siphoning most of its money to the haves, and high rates of return mean squeezing someone or something. One of the first laws put into effect in Iraq after the invasion and occupation was to protect the patenting of plants and seeds. The idea was to control Iraqi agriculture with the likes of Monsanto, Bayer, Syngenta, and Dow Chemical. Americans work 25.1 more hours per person than Germans, which average 18.6 hours. Conservatives need to control things and people. The economic setup in America today that many people worship as if it were a religion has not always been with us. It is something new. It is an offshoot of old style capitalism. It is a mutation, a deadly mutation. In recent decades, this economic mutation has become entwined with American politics and traditional Christianity. It is now treated like a sacred cow and cannot be criticized without it being taken as a criticism of mom and apple pie. This mutated form of capitalism has allowed an obscene growth of corporations and corporate power. Today, corporations appear as ravenous dinosaurs that devour everything in their way. The U.S. government is now the only counterweight that can restrain these beasts. Yet our representatives have been neutered by money. They are impotent in being able to contain corporate power, and they are complicit in any devastation that the corporations wrought. Theodore Roosevelt was quite prescient when he warned that the federal government was the single body competent to bring the great corporations to heel. Our problems with corporate bribery are nothing new. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke quite honestly when he declared that our government operated for the benefit of the wealthy. Roosevelt rightly called Republicans Tories. Not much has changed. Things have only gotten more intense and dire. Since the Gilded Age, the Republican approach has been every man for himself. Franklin D. Roosevelt said that every one of us is entitled to the opportunity to earn a living and develop himself to the fullest measure consistent with the rights of his fellow men. In 1932, Giuseppe Zangara tried to shoot FDR, but he killed the mayor of Chicago instead. When Zangara got the electric chair, he shouted, "Lousy capitalists! All capitalists, lousy bunch of crooks!" FDR called those on Wall Street unscrupulous money changers. As a result of this, business and counterfeit patriots planned a coup against FDR. In the Great Depression, people went hungry, while farmers dumped their milk and left crops in the field. By 1933, production of farms and factories fell by 1/3. Prices also fell. 25%, or some 12 million people, were unemployed. 5,000 banks failed, and the stock market lost 75% of its value since 1929. 500,000 homes were foreclosed, and property values dropped like an out-of-control elevator. The problem at the heart of the Great Depression was excess capacity in regard to demand, as well as a contracted money supply. Deflation was also a problem. The Great Depression showed that output had to be checked, restrained, or markets had to expand continuously. Endlessly expanding markets is one of the tenets of the free market ideology. FDR also said that no business that depends for its existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. He also made it clear that a sound economic system of a nation is a greater factor in its well-being than the price of its currency. Senator Huey Long sought a guaranteed income for every family in America, paid for by taxes from the rich, while Upton Sinclair declared that capitalism has served its time and is passing from the surface of the earth. A new system must be found to take its place. Andrew Carnegie wrote that where wealth accrues honorably, the people are always silent partners. Harold Ickes said that communism was merely a bugaboo, and that it is fascist-minded men of America who are the real enemies of our institutions, through their solidarity and their ability and willingness to turn the wealth of America against the welfare of America. FDR said the enemies were the forces of privilege and greed. Alf Landon had it correct when he noted that as a civilization becomes more complex, government power must increase. Yet Republicans seek a small and impotent government that has no regulatory power over business. Franklin D. Roosevelt said that there were four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. FDR also felt that there were several rights: the right to a job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food, clothing, and recreation, the right for a farmer to earn a decent living, the right of every businessman to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate mental care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, the right to a good education. Much of this agenda sounds like the millennial world of tomorrow promised by the Bible. Even as far back as the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville observed that the rich felt a deep disgust with America's democratic institutions. He noted that the people were a power they feared and despised. De Tocqueville also understood the relativity factor concerning taxes when he observed that a tax imposed on a large fortune subtracts only that which is superfluous and causes little pain. But nothing is as disastrous as a heavy tax on a small fortune. A tax that a wealthy man can easily pay would reduce a poor man to misery. He also perceived that when the rich alone govern, the interests of the poor are always imperiled. Enlarging on this theme, he understood that if America was to ever experience a revolution, it would be brought about by inequality of conditions, which simply is the powerful bending the acts of government to their special purposes. Evil can appear perfectly normal to even the best man and woman of a given time. No one can deny this after living through the 8 years of the Bush-Cheney administration. American politics has been hijacked by a tiny coterie of right-wing economic extremists, some of them ideological zealots, others merely greedy, a few of them possibly insane. Let's understand one thing: tax cuts and lowering the marginal tax rate do not of and by themselves spur the economy. The top tax rate during the Eisenhower administration was 91%, and the economy was doing well. So was the middle class. In 1979, the top tenth of 1% of the rich took home 3% of the national income. Today, their take is 10%, and their tax rate has dropped from 32% to 23%. In contrast, the minimum wage has lost 50% of its purchasing power. Millions of low-paid workers, those collecting Social Security and SSI, can no longer participate in the economy when it comes to big-ticket items. In 1972, someone bringing home $320 a month could purchase a brand new car for $2,400. But today, with that person making 4 times the $320 a month, he cannot buy a brand new car. It seems that cultural issues have crowded out our knowledge of economic issues. It's the "what's the matter with Kansas" syndrome. Amateur and crank supply-siders have managed to bring the United States economy to its knees. According to Dick Cheney, deficits don't matter. In the face of history, supply-siders and Friedmanites still chant their mantra that tax cuts for the rich will spur the economy. From 1947 to 1964, the top tax rate in the United States was 91%, and the economy from 1947 to 1973 grew at the rate of 4% yearly. History shows that as the top tax rate has dwindled, the economy has suffered. In 1981, the top tax rate was 50%, and in 1986, Reagan cut it to 28%. It was in the late 1970s when the supply-siders captured the Republican Party. Irving Kristol admitted that supply-side economics was more a political tool rather than an economic theory. The theory is well liked by the rich. Tax rates determine everything for supply-siders. The fiscal conservative of today is a supply-sider. In 1961, only 50 corporations had lobbyists. But today, lobbyists are quite numerous, and Republicans allow lobbyists to write legislation. Dishonesty has become integral to the Republican economic agenda. Their agenda is far out of step with the majority of the voting public. Lying has become a systematic necessity. As a result of deliberate, targeted tax cuts, the rich now take home a greater share of this country's income base, and they are paying a lower rate on that money. This has led to an upward redistribution of income, and this is the central theme of the conservative and Republican economic program. Republicans govern by withholding information and obscuring choices from the public. Can we all say Medicare Part D? Dick Armey called bipartisanship date rape. The right wing has had success making absurd ideas seem normal. The Republican Party's one objective is not smaller government. It is the protecting and expanding the wealth of the very rich. Populism was a class movement that was born in the 1870s. It's a movement and political doctrine that supports the little guy, ordinary folks, that fight against the moneyed elites. Populism challenges the orthodoxy of the corporate order and seeks to empower ordinary Americans so that they can control their own destinies. Populists want to reform the system of too big to fail. They want business and government to serve the common good rather than the greedy interests of corporations and wealthy elites. Historically, the Populist Party merged with the Democrats in 1896. But there doesn't seem to be too much populism in today's Democratic Party. Where were the populists when these bailouts began? To jumpstart an aggregate economy, people must have money to spend. They must buy things which will create business expansion and jobs. Bailing out bankrupt banks only allows them to offer us more credit when being overleveraged was part of the financial meltdown. There were no reserves. Helping Wall Street was not the answer. It is Main Street that needs a bailout. Are you listening, President Obama?